Hello again, this is Rich Zwelling, and with me is my dad.
Len Zwelling.
Hello, and we're here to talk about what happened on Washington in the past few days with the failure of Ryan Care slash Trump Care, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what you would call it.
It was an attempt at a repealing Obamacare that failed.
Now, you were talking at one point about why it failed specifically, and I know
In Washington, there are four Ps.
the four Ps.
Very important when you talk about how things get legislated in Washington. The first one is the policy itself. Everybody thinks that's the most important part. That's the least important part. The most important part actually goes on. You go from policy to process, how it gets done, to the politics, which is how the two parties and the individuals within the parties work to get something done, to the personalities, which of course is the essence of how anything gets done anywhere.
I'm getting a sense this is an ascending order of importance.
That is ascending order of importance.
So personality and politics at the top.
Yeah, so if you start at the bottom with the policy itself was not favorable for passage. It took, as the Congressional Budget Office said, about 14 million people would have lost their health insurance next year.
And that was in your blog post, I know you said the 6%. You were saying that's like we're essentially talking about 6% of the population.
If you want to go,
right?
you can go back a little bit further.
Yeah.
The part of the market for health insurance, I'm not talking about health care now, I'm talking about health insurance.
An important distinction.
The great majority of health insurance in this country is provided by employers. We're not talking about that. There's about 175 to 180 million people in this country who get their health insurance through their employers. None of this applies to them.
Right.
For the most part, this applies to the 16% or so of the population who do not have access to one form of health insurance or another, Medicare, Medicaid, or employer provided.
So you're saying the people that don't have any access to anything.
Right, that's about a sixth of the population.
A sixth, yeah, you said 16%. Right?
So under Obamacare in 2010, roughly half of that number got covered in one way or the other, either through the extension of Medicaid or through making health insurance affordable and available to those people who in the past it was neither for. Okay? That turned out to be about somewhere between 10 and 20 million people. So it didn't get the 50 million done. So if you stop and say, what was the goal of Obamacare? And if you say, and you'd be right if you said this, the goal of Obamacare was to get more people insured.
Right.
The answer was, it was successful, but only minimally so.
And this is what I thought was interesting in your blog post, is you said you're often asked, were you for Obamacare? And your answer I think was interesting, because you said, yes, but reluctantly.
It's by a hair. It was a little bit better than not getting done. It didn't really get the job done, which is to provide some form of guaranteed insurability at an affordable rate for all Americans. That still doesn't apply.
Right.
And we're the only advanced country in the world where that's not the case.
And I know that one of the interesting things, I thought you did this in your talk when you talked about your book a little bit, is that Obama and Nancy Pelosi in 2010 had to kind of ram this through Congress, right? They had to, without, what was it, Tom Daschle, you said, without Tom Daschle's...
There's a whole lot of, ins and outs and why the Obamacare legislation, when it turned into actual law, got formulated the way it did. The biggest problem with it was really that to get it through the Senate required 60 votes, because the Senate has a very strange rule which any one senator can block any piece of legislation doing a filibuster, and to override that filibuster and force a vote costs 60 votes. And when the Democrats initially passed their version of Obamacare, they had 60 votes. When it came back to the Senate, because the House had passed a version of the bill that wasn't identical, which means they don't really have one bill, they had two, and you got to have one before it goes to the president. They no longer had their 60, they had 59. And so it would have had to go to a conference committee, which is both Democrats and Republicans and members of the House and members of the Senate, and the members of the Senate on the conference committee would have blocked it, the Republican members.
Right.
So it would never have gotten through. So instead, what Nancy Pelosi did is took the passed version from the Senate, rammed it through the House, and then the changes they need to make, they passed by something called reconciliation, which is only 51 votes in the Senate and has to reduce the deficit. So they basically split the bill. Obamacare really is two pieces of bill. One was the one that was passed by the Senate on Christmas Eve in 2009, and the next was passed back in March of 2010, and those bills are what President Obama signed March 23rd.
And I guess the reason why I asked about the politics of what went on back in 2009 and 2010 is to kind of compare it or contrast it to what happened this past week.
It's the same damn thing.
Okay, and that's what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, the problem was the Republicans made all the same mistakes the Democrats made without having the benefit of having a big enough majority in the Senate. They didn't have 60 seats, they only have 52. And what that mandated is anything emanating from the House had to be reducing the budget, which it was. If you looked at the CBO score, the bill that was passed, that was at least offered, would have reduced the budget. And so could have been passed by 51 votes in the Senate. Problem is it lost a lot of people from the insurance rolls.
Right.
So I'm not sure it would have done any good. So there's that. But the other problem is, unlike the Democrats when they controlled the House in 2010, the Republicans controlling the House now couldn't stick together.
Yeah.
They were basically in three major factions.
The Freedom
Caucus,
one,
which are the sort of the Tea Party, the very extreme right.
Right.
The Tuesday Group, which are moderate Republicans, and then the vast majority of Republicans who are kind of in the middle. And most of the people in the middle and some of the Tuesday Group probably could have been made to come along.
But the problem, I would imagine...
The Freedom Caucus...
Well, the Freedom Caucus was never
going to come along. And they're big enough, I think they had at least 32, 33 members, that would have been enough to sink the bill in the House. And that's why it never came up for a vote, because it was never going to pass.
And among the more moderate Republicans, it sounded like, I mean, to what extent this is true or not true, but talking about the idea that they have constituents to cater to at home. Groups of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, all of whom have various interests, and some of whom really did not want to see this bill pass.
Yeah, well, apparently there was a poll that was taken. I think it was a Quinnipiac poll that showed that only 17% of the American people supported the bill. The problem was that one of the things that Obamacare did, it made available Medicaid to a larger group of individuals. The Supreme Court rendered an opinion that basically said each state can decide whether to expand Medicaid. Some red states, like Texas, did not expand Medicaid.
Right, because they had
but some did, like Ohio, and the ones that did benefited greatly because half of Medicaid funding comes from the federal government. So in this particular case, up until 2017, 100% of the federal part of the expansion of Medicaid was covered by the federal government. So states like Ohio, who expanded their Medicaid under a Republican governor, still didn't want to lose that, and this bill would have lost it.
Right.
So that's the moderates for the most part.
And I guess what the equation of this is Paul Ryan. I mean, thinking about what degree this failure can be attributed to Paul Ryan's politics or his personality. You talked about politics versus... I mean, I've seen a lot written and a lot talked about regarding to what extent he could be blamed or not be blamed. And I guess, I mean, what's your take specifically on how Paul Ryan led this whole thing?
I think he bit off about as much as he could. He had to come up with a bill that would cost less money if he was going to get it through the Senate. He knew that. So he did that. A bill that cost less money only really reached some of the issues surrounding Obamacare. A couple of the issues within Obamacare, like the pre-existing condition guarantee and the guarantee for insurability for those under 26 on their parents' policies, the public just loves. They just don't want those to go away, so he had to preserve those. So when the extreme right wing of the party said this was Obamacare light, they had a point. To a large extent, a fair amount of Obamacare was preserved in the new bill. It really wasn't a repeal. It surely wasn't a replace. And perhaps the best thing to say about it is those things that were repealed didn't really matter all that much. And whatever was repealed and replaced was poorer. So it was a really ill-conceived piece of legislation that I think they thought they could get through as an early victory. And it just blew up in their face.
Because there was so much disagreement amongst the Republicans themselves. I mean,
yes,
yeah.
In the House, it's generally said, if you have the majority in the House, you should be able to pass any piece of legislation you want if you can keep your caucus together. The problem the Republicans have had under Mr. Boehner and now under Mr. Ryan is they cannot keep their caucus together.
And is that just as a result of the Freedom Caucus and their obstinance, or is it larger than that, do you think?
Well, it's politics. I think these folks are elected from districts that want that kind of representation. And the way that the Republicans have redistricted the country, those people are mostly sitting in safe electoral...
So we're talking about gerrymandering.
They're gerrymandered into, and they're going to be there forever. And they know that the only threat to their office is an attack from the right, not from the left.
Which makes them
so if they keep going conservative, they're never going to lose. And in fact, this district that we're sitting in right now in Bel Air, which is represented by John Culberson, is one of those districts. I mean, there is nothing that Mr. Culberson can do to lose as long as he stays right.
And it's not as if, I mean, that's not to say that gerrymandering is the province specifically of the right. I mean, this is something that's been utilized by the left, by Democrats, Republicans for ages, right? So
correct. I mean, it's always been going on. If you win the election in a year that ends in 0, the census comes out and you get to redistrict, and that's just the way it is. So redistricting involves, if a lot of people move from, let's say, from New York to Arizona, Arizona will pick up members of the House, and New York may lose some. And to do that, you have to redistrict, and that's just sort of the way things go.
Yeah. Now, the other thing to talk about, of course, is the philosophical kind of underpinning, and you talk about this in your book, you talked about this in some of your talks, but the whole idea that we haven't really been able to agree yet on what approach we as a society should take to healthcare. And I like the example you give with the Gucci slippers versus the fire department. Are we a public service or a private service?
Well, people haven't, I mean, I don't think it's that they haven't decided. I think it's they haven't even discussed it.
Yeah,
I don't think there's been anybody articulate the problem of healthcare as one of, is it a utility like the fire department and the police department, or is it a good, a commodity like toilet paper and Gucci loafers? It turns out in this country, it's both. If you're over 65, it's a guaranteed right because you have Medicare. If you're not over 65 and you're not employed by someone who provides you health insurance, you're out of luck. You either have to provide it for yourself or go without. And Obamacare basically said you cannot go without. There was the mandate. You had to have health insurance. But a lot of people went without and paid the penalty. And the problem with that is if they got sick, then someone has to pick up the cost.
Yeah, and which leads you to the other part of what you were talking about, which is the whole idea of, everybody's idea, I'll let you do it, the Norm Ornstein. Everybody's idea of healthcare reform is the same. I pay less.
Yeah. This is all about money for all intents and purposes. Yeah. It's a group of competing interests, the insurance industry, the healthcare providers, the drug companies, the large hospital chains, each of whom are trying to foist off the course of their costs on another aspect of the healthcare industrial complex. And that's the game that's being played. And until a referee comes into the game and says, no, we're not playing that game anymore, we're changing the rules. And the rules are, we're going to try to provide people with health care, not insurance, health care.
Yeah.
And to do that, we've got to pick up the tab. And we're going to pick it up as a society.
Yeah, which leads me to a more personal question, I guess, which was your own. I mean, I've listened to you talk about this over years, and you have an interesting mix of philosophy, because I've kind of struggled to decide. I mean, you've said you've always talked about your dislike of Obamacare, but sometimes it sounded like you didn't like it strictly because of the policy, but sometimes you decided it didn't go far enough. Like
it didn't go far enough.
So is that to say you advocate for single payer?
Absolutely, I'm a single payer person. Okay. I don't see any other logical solution. I think insurance is a good idea. We have insurance for our cars, and it's mandated, but not by the federal government. It's mandated by the states. And what it basically says is you cannot drive a car without having liability insurance, which doesn't really cover you at all. It covers the person you hit.
But is that possible, considering the obstinance that we have? I mean, I'm not trying to necessarily, pick on one group or the other, but I mean, there's obviously so much gridlock. There's so much disagreement over the issue of what, healthcare or health insurance is. Is it a right? Is it a privilege? Is it realistic to expect that we could get to single payer? I mean,
we will get to single payer for a host of reasons.
You believe that we will?
Oh, sure.
Oh, you do?
I don't know if I'll see it, but I think you'll see it. we'll get to single payer because after we try everything else, we'll have to resort to the one that actually works. And it's been demonstrated to work in countries all over the world, from Asia to Europe to Australia to South America. All of them have some sort of universal health coverage for all of their people. That doesn't preclude the opportunity of having Cadillac health insurance.
Sure, sure.
I mean, in Switzerland,
Switzerland. I was thinking Switzerland, where you have both, right?
Yeah, they
I
have
mean,
both. But
yeah.
the basic insurance is given in a non-profit fashion. The other insurance, if you want an executive policy of some sort, maybe it includes psychiatry and plastic surgery, then you have to pay more, and it's a for-profit. Mm-hmm. And none of the insurance companies in Switzerland, as far as I know, have gone out of business. And I think if you think about it like car insurance, I think it's the easiest explanation. If you say that liability insurance is what everybody has to have, because everybody's exposed to hurting somebody else and having to pick up a bill they can't afford. So you have to have liability insurance. You don't have to have collision insurance, because if you wreck your car, you either can do without a car or you can buy a new one, depending on what you want to do. But that doesn't put anybody else out. Mm-hmm. Liability insurance becomes mandated. Well, the same thing can be true in health insurance. Why do you have health insurance? Because you and your illness are a liability to the whole system. And the question is, how does the system collectively, in a communitarian fashion, deal with this problem? And that's what the United States has not been able to get to.
Right.
There's too much individualization in the thinking. And when the Republicans argue, why should a man need to have maternity insurance, or why should a woman have to have insurance covering prostate care, the answer is the only way to spread the risk is to spread the risk over everyone, for everything.
Yeah.
Nothing else makes any sense, and that is a single-payer system.
But it seems to run in the face of that kind of classic American ideal of individualism and kind of, or whether you would call it, I guess, freedom of choice, or what the Republicans say, personal responsibility. Yeah, I mean,
personal responsibility never comes into the discussion and doesn't need to. Mm-hmm. If you say that insurance will be provided for you through the government via taxes, it will be administered in the private sector if you wish, or just like Medicare. There's a million ways to do it. There's no one right way.
Right. We
do know the wrong way, though, and the wrong way is what we're doing now. We're spending way too much money on administrative costs. There's about $3 trillion per year spent on healthcare in this country, and about $1 trillion of it is on administrative costs for health insurance.
So there is an economic argument to be made for single-payer health.
It's a strong one.
Yeah, it's a very strong one. And
we'd spend a lot less money on health care. Well, look at the other countries in the world. Nobody spends even half as much per capita as we do on health insurance. The largest spender on health insurance spends about half. We spend $9,000-$10,000 per person on health insurance. The second is like $5,000.
But so you think it'll happen eventually, but is it going to be just a gradual process over time, or do you think there's going to have to be some kind of discrete point, like a ball dropping, where there's going to be like a seismic shift all at once?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. If we keep making mistakes like the ones we've been making that really don't make a positive impact, and Obamacare made a positive impact in that it insured more people, but there's no question the Republicans' argument about prices going up and deductibles going up and co-pays going up and insurance companies leaving markets.
You hear that all the time, because
it would have happened anyway, even without Obamacare, because it's not a profitable business to be in. And if you think about the value added of insurance companies, you realize there is none. The insurance companies don't provide health care. All they do is shuffle paper. They take in money and they put out money, and they keep some for themselves.
Which I don't know if you feel this way, but my full disclosure, I'm also for single payer personally, so I have to reveal my bias. But at the same time, I mean, my basic philosophical argument against the insurance industry is that it's one thing to insure your home, a physical property that, things could happen to it, not happen to it, but monetizing human life and human health, there seems to be a component in my mind that's inherently morally untenable.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
You don't agree with that?
No, because I think you do have to monetize it, because we know what the cost is. The cost is $3 trillion. We have 330 million people in the country, and we spend $3 trillion to cover.
Well, to rephrase then, I mean, my argument for single payer, as in like you said, you spread the risk across the population. You don't throw everybody into the abyss and say fend for yourself and make it
you don't
zero.
throw anybody into the abyss.
Yes.
It's not everybody; it's anybody.
Right.
You basically say if every single person in the country has value, for a moment we'll make that argument, then it is in the country's best interest to keep the population as healthy as possible. And the best way to keep the population healthy is actually preventative care and health maintenance, which is never talked about at all.
That's a good point. So, preventative medicine.
So that has to be incorporated into it, and it was incorporated into Obamacare. Cancer screening was in there. Well, baby cares were in there, and it was zero. It was costing nothing. So mammograms were completely paid for because they were valued even greater than cancer care. They were valued at the highest, and I think that that's kind of the way to start thinking. The bad news in this is the moment you're born, you have
your genetic makeup. You can't choose that.
Yeah, you can't choose that.
Right.
By definition, life is a pre-existing condition. Everybody dies. And it's only a matter of how do we keep the population as healthy as possible for as long as possible, and to do so at an economically reasonable rate so it's not a drain on GDP. And the current system is not that system.
Sure, absolutely. And it's not to say that when the Republicans talk about their economic concerns, like what you hear, I heard a Republican House member who represents part of Staten Island, I think, and he was talking about how because of Obamacare, it is true that premiums for the people in his district have gone up and made things tougher for people. But that goes back to my point about kind of viewing this as a zero-sum game. It's like when you start to monetize something like this, and you said you're born with your genetics. You don't choose your genetics, so you're just SOL if you happen to be born with something that requires constant health maintenance, and you get these bills, or you have to...
That's because we deal with this problem as a personal problem, and we refuse to deal with this problem as a society.
Exactly. I guess that's a good way to put it. That's what I was trying to articulate, the idea that you can't call it my individual responsibility to have good genetics. I mean, I'm born with the genetics I have, and if I'm genetically predisposed to a certain disease that requires I be on medication for the rest of my life, that's through no fault of my own. And what we haven't started to talk about is the idea that, well, we need to make a decision. I mean, it seems to me the morally right thing to do to say, okay, well, we're interested in maintaining, our, robustness, for lack of a better term, with the society as a whole. It may cost something. It may cost a little bit extra in tax dollars. It may cost a little bit extra on the line, but we save it in that maybe...
I would argue it would probably wind up costing less.
Yeah.
If we stop spending money on those things that really don't go to make us healthier. Now, the argument that you make about genetics is a little easier to make than the argument about things like smoking and obesity, where there are specific lifestyle choices made by individuals which increase their risk. So then the question becomes, should we prorate their insurance? Well, that's what underwriting was, and that's the way it was before Obamacare. And under Obamacare, they limited it to 3 times what the baseline amount. You can't charge older people more than 3 times more than when you charge younger people. Under the new bill, it would have been 5 times, which is one of the objections some of the people had to it, some of the moderate Republicans had to it, because they thought that would price their older populations out of the insurance market, which they had barely managed to get in under Obamacare. But the real question is there a responsibility of the society to reduce the risk of things like behavioral choices? And the only way to do that is through education. There is no other way.
I was going to circle back to your point about preventative. I mean, whether it's preventative care or preventative education.
It's not going to be 100%. No, there's still going to be people who are massively obese and put themselves at risk to heart disease. There are still going to be people who use cigarettes and put themselves at risk for cardiac disease as well as lung cancer. But if you educate the population that these things are bad, educate the population when they're children on how to avoid them, then the society has done as much as it can to preclude increasing risk. That doesn't mean nobody will increase risk. Remember, there are still people that ride motorcycles without helmets. There are people that drive too fast. There are people that text when they're driving.
We live in Houston.
We know this is a bad idea. People do it anyway. People do all kinds of crazy things. All government or society can do is try to decrease those risks, decrease the probabilities. As I'm fond of saying, we are a deterministic species living in a probabilistic universe. We think we want to find causes for everything. Sometimes it's just bad luck. But for those things where we know causes, we've got to decrease the risk from those causes. And that's a matter of decreasing probability. And that's a matter of education for the most part.
Right. But of course, then you run into the classic problem of, the individualistic philosophy is, why should I pay for somebody else's education, or why should I pay for somebody else's health care? Why should I?
No, we've dealt with that. We have public schools.
We have public schools, and you pointed out we have, Medicaid and Medicare.
Yeah, we have all kinds of. The idea that there's not a socialized systems in the country is ridiculous. About half of America, as George Will has pointed out many times, half of Americans get their health care through the government. If you add Medicare and Medicaid, which are about 60 million each, roughly speaking, plus all the VA and all the people in the armed services, it's a lot of people who are covered by government-sponsored insurance. Mm-hmm. So the idea that the government isn't in our health care is preposterous. Of course it's in our health care. I would argue it needs to get into the health care completely and level it out so everybody has equal access to health care at an equal cost. And that's the taxes. And it should be progressive. There is no reason it can't be part of your income tax. In fact, Medicare is. The Medicare system, if you think the Medicare system is bad, and you hear people talk about that all the time, go ask somebody over 65 whether they want to give it up. Go run on that. Go run for governor of Florida under a platform of giving up Medicare. That won't work. No. And so I think that the overwhelming evidence for the last 50 years since Medicare came into effect is that it is successful, and it can be successful for people under 65. I would argue it probably could be more successful because they're probably less sick.
So are you, I guess to round this up, are you optimistic, pessimistic, a combination of the two as far as, the progress towards something like that, towards single payer, towards this?
Well, I'm very optimistic in the sense that this bill fell. I was concerned that this bill may have come to being, and we would be taking a huge step backwards.
Why?
This would have been.
What in your mind?
Well, I mean, 14 or somewhere between 14 and 20 million people would have lost their health insurance. That's not good.
No.
I mean, there's nothing you can say to make that good. There's nothing the Republicans, they cannot put lipstick on this pig and say that it's not a pig. It's a pig. And this bill was a pig. So the fact that the right wing of the Republican Party and the moderates, both in the House and the Senate, overwhelmed this awful bill was probably a good thing. It gives me hope. To get to a single-payer system is going to take a long time. My guess is that artificial intelligence may have a lot to do with getting us to a single-payer system.
Interesting. Now that's an interesting topic to broach.
If you think, as I do, that there will come a day when your history, your physical exam, and your laboratory data get plugged into a computer, and the computer spits out what's wrong with you and what you should be getting, then the doctor has a very different role. The doctor's role is the administration of care, not the administration of disease management. Disease management should be doable in most cases by a computer. I know most doctors hate that, but it's been shown now that up in Sloan Kettering that when they put data for cancer into a computer, into Watson, and they started to query Watson, they found out that Watson was every bit as good as a tumor board full of geniuses at predicting, making the diagnosis and predicting the therapy. So it's reasonable to presume that less drastic diseases than cancer can be handled in
much
this
better
fish.
with something like Watson. Yeah.
So if that's the case, then you go to your doctor, you get the baseline study, which none of which needs to be done by a doctor. Your history and your physical and your lab tests can all be done by nurse practitioners or some sort of physician assistants. That goes into a computer. The computer spits it out. Then the doctor digests what the computer says, talks to you,
That's what I was
and the
gonna ask
entire
you.
time of the half-hour visit is spent discussing what's good for you.
In other words, so you think that would actually be beneficial to the so-called like the arts part of medicine, like the actual?
Well, actually, it would be both. The science will be better because it's based
Right.
on hard science, and the art will be better because the doctors can concentrate on that and not think of themselves as a lab technician.
Sure. Well, I bring that up because I think a lot of people might intuit that it would be the opposite. That if things go too much towards AI, then the art might be lost.
If you talk to doctors, their biggest complaints is they're doing clerk work. If they could get back to being doctor work, the ability to increase the number of doctors in this country would go way up. And even if the income doesn't go up, the pleasantness of the job would, and the job satisfaction would be go up
and
so
the
much
impetus
higher.
to actually go into the field.
Yeah,
for younger people.
You're not there as a technician collecting data.
Right.
You are there actually handling data and interpreting data and fitting that data to the individual needs of the patient, which is what doctors ought to be doing.
And you think that will to bring it back, you think that will accelerate the march towards single payer?
Sure, because then you really are offering everybody the same thing.
Interesting. Okay.
You can't say, well, I can't go to a good doctor. Well, you can go to a good computer because they're all the same.
Yeah.
It'll be one computer. And not to mention the amount of research that could be done if we can pass legislation to allow those data to be used in an anonymous fashion to do medical research would be unbelievably rewarding. We would be far advanced. So there are opportunities, huge opportunities in medicine, but I wouldn't look to Congress to give us a solution.
Well, that's what I mean. I guess in the next few months, in the next few years, possibly. I mean, where is all this headed?
Nowhere.
You don't think it will?
No, I think one thing Congress doesn't do is revisit things. So it's about 5 years, and here it was 7. So it's not likely that Congress will revisit an issue in less than 5 years. So I think you can safely say that if Mr. Trump gets reelected, it won't be till his second term that they make another go at this. And I think he's moving on to infrastructure and tax revisions and other things. I think one thing he's very good at is moving on. And I think he will.
Yeah. And, well, I mean, not really much choice now, I guess, but...
Mr. Ryan will just have to lick his wounds.
But, I mean, it kind of feels like you said there was this feeling of inevitability about it when we had, 8 years of...
I think Winston Churchill said it. America does, it finally does the right thing when it's finished destroying everything else. Sure, it's a terrible paraphrasing. But the point is that that's exactly what the United States does. It does everything wrong first.
It bumbles first, yeah.
And then it manages to braille its way to the right solution. I am very confident it will braille its way to the right solution because the solutions lie in genomics, artificial intelligence, and economics. And they're far stronger drivers than Congress and politics.
So you don't take the same doomsdaying position from people who say that the United States is like the Roman Empire in decline kind of thing.
Never. You never get me to agree with that, ever. I think we'll figure it out. It just will take time.
Yeah. Oh, who's hoping for the next generation? Because,
Or some generations.
Yeah, some
in the
generation.
Future. Yep. Not me.
Yeah. All right, well, good chat.
Okay.
We'll be back. Thanks for listening.
So what do you put it on YouTube?
Yeah. YouTube's next.
And then I can post it on my